Hello, it's just me. This is a short story I wrote, which I'd like to share with you. It is very loosely inspired by the song Snowy by Itzy, because the overall sound and one of the lyrics just gave me the mental image of a sort of fairy tale story like this, and I ran with it. I don't think any particular content warnings apply to this, but if you want to make extra sure, I have put a brief synopsis in the description with some more details. As I read the story to you, the text will also be on screen. You can also listen to this like a podcast, or turn off the sound and just read. Feel free to adjust the playback speed and enjoy at your own pace. Now let's begin. If someone had asked Hans what winter sounded like, he would most likely have said a music box. His mother must have thought the same, because when the days grew short and the nights grew cold, and out came the colorful quilts from the chest at the foot of the big bed, nestled among them was the music box. Made of smooth varnished wood with a tulip carved into the lid, it came out from between the quilts to its place of honor on the mantel, and most nights Mother would open the box and turn the brass crank to wind up the mechanism that made all the tiny gears spin. These spun the wheel with the tiny spikes, and those plucked the tiny fingers of metal so that music filled the little house, quick and sparkling at first, then slower, slower, until it was quiet once more. Hans and his sister used to make a game of trying to guess which note would be the last, as they dripped one by one from the box, like the last drops of melting snow from the eaves in spring. "Why does it always end so soon?" Hans used to ask. "Everything has to end sometime," Mother said. Hans didn't think that was a good reason at all, but he was still a child and frequently didn't understand why adults said the things they did. Now that he was nearly an adult himself, he unfortunately understood more of what Mother had meant. A short winter day was already drawing to a close, and soon he would have to wish his friends good night and skate quickly if he wanted to make it home before the sun went down. "Tomorrow, we'll start early and skate up the river as far as we can go," said Carl. He said that every evening. "Maybe we can get to the lake in time to be back for dinner." He said that every evening too, and every day someone was late, or they got busy chasing each other up and down the canals in town, or the ice on the river wasn't yet thick enough to skate on, and the oldest Smith boy fell through. He was almost frozen solid by the time they got him home, but the doctor said he'd be all right. Hans shuffled his skates back and forth on the ice. "We don't have to go all the way to the lake, do we? It's hardly bigger than the mill pond anyway." "We always go to the lake," said Gerwin, as if that explained everything. "No, we don't," said Carl. "You're all too slow." "You're the slow one," said Gerwin. "Tomorrow we'll go." The lake itself wasn't really anything very special, just a large pond in a nearby farmer's field, but because it was so far away, it was something of a novelty to the boys of the town. "Meet at the river tomorrow, first thing after school," said Carl. "Don't be late." Hans would have liked to run there the moment the school bell rang the next day, but first he had to see that his little sister made it safely home. Ada was still young enough to be prone to wandering, and didn't quite know her way around the little town yet. "Don't you know your way home by now?" Hans groused when she turned a little pirouette at the corner and started down the street in the entirely wrong direction. "I have to show you something," she said. "Not now." But she wasn't stopping, so Hans chased after her. "Come on, I have somewhere to go." "It's very important," said Ada, leaving her mitten in Hans's hand and plucking it back again with practiced ease. "Quickly, just look." There was no arguing with her when she set her mind to something, unless Hans wanted to drag her home kicking and bellowing, so he hurried after her. "This had better be fast, and then we'll have to run home." Ada agreed amicably to this, and led him to the little shop at the center of town that was always full of strange trinkets, and pressed her drippy nose to the glass. Mother would like that. "She would. Now let's go," said Hans. "No, look." Sighing, Hans pressed his nose to the cold glass too. "What is it?" "A snow globe," said Ada. "It plays music like a music box, but look." Hans looked again. In the middle of the broad shop window sat a strange ornament, like a glass bubble, balanced on a base painted to look like the surface of a frozen lake surrounded by a forest. In the center of the lake spun a tiny porcelain girl in a blue porcelain dress. One tiny white boot and skate arched nearly above her head, so that her leg resembled the petal of a crocus. She slowed and finally stopped, and one of the shopkeeper's daughters picked the globe up, turned it upside down to wind up a little crank on the bottom, and set it down again. Glittering snow floated down over the tiny girl while she spun faster than before, around and around. "Isn't she beautiful?" Ada sighed, now with her ear pressed to the glass. "Listen." Faintly through the window, Hans could hear the light playing of a music box. As it slowed, the skater slowed too. Plink, plink, plink. Hans held his breath in the lengthening pauses between each note, but finally it really did come to an end. The tiny skater waited poised in the space between breaths for someone to wind her up again. "She must be so lonely," said Ada, and then she sniffled against the smudgy window, and Hans remembered the time. "Come on, let's run," he said. Ada was laughing again by the time Hans left her at their door and raced to put on his skates and meet his friends where the canal became the river at the edge of town. He needn't have worried about being late. Carl had stopped to talk to a girl in their class and arrived last of all, for which they all teased him and pelted him with a bouquet of snowballs when he finally did arrive. "Do you think we still have time to make it there and back?" he said, while brushing snow out of his hair. He said that every day. "Only if you can keep up with me," cried Joseph. Hans never could keep up with Joseph, but he tried his best, more running than skating, until the lake finally came into view. By then it was late afternoon, but they still had a little time to play, swooping in wide circles around the lake's edge and spinning as fast as they could until all but one either got dizzy and fell down or slowed to a stop like the girl in the snow globe when the music wound to an end. Hans tried to hold his foot the way she had, but he couldn't reach that far, and Gerwin said he looked like a cow with an itch. He didn't mind that so much, because Gerwin would say anyone looked like a cow if given the chance, so it had kind of lost its meaning. He did fall down and lose the game, however, so he didn't try it again. Too soon, the sun had sunk low enough that they knew they must be getting home. Just as he turned to go, a movement on the lake caught Hans's eye. Where he thought he might have seen one of his friends, there was a figure he didn't recognize, but in the second that he glanced away to check if the others had seen, the stranger was gone. "Come on, you're slow enough as it is," Carl shouted, and Hans hurried to catch up. The watery light of a winter sunset was failing as they skated for home and waved to each other as they turned off toward their own houses. By the time Hans reached the end of the smallest canal, it was almost fully dark, but the white cottage stood out like a beacon with the last of the day's light. "There you are." Ada stood in the doorway, feet planted apart and little fist squarely on her hips. "I thought you got lost." "You're the one who gets lost." Ada shrugged and allowed him inside. "Don't be so late next time." After supper, she spun around and around to the music box until Mother blew out the candle and said it was time for bed. Carl had promised he wouldn't be late again, not that Hans believed him, but just in case, it was reason enough to hurry after school. Ada was in a hurry too, but once again in the opposite direction. "Not today," Hans called without much hope, but she was well on her way with no signs of stopping. He ran after her, past the church, the candle shop, and the bridge, and she rounded the corner to the next street about a dozen paces ahead of him to scuffle to a stop and peer in the window. "She's gone!" Hans slowed, tiptoeing the rest of the way to the window, but Ada was still wailing when he joined her. The snow globe was no longer where it had been the day before. "Maybe they put her in the back," he offered. Ada would not be consoled, either by that or by the suggestion that someone had bought the snow globe so the little figurine wouldn't be lonely anymore. She refused to run home despite all Hans's insisting, and instead shuffled morosely behind him, occasionally making her dismay remembered with a pointed moan of misery. When Hans finally reached the meeting place at the mouth of the river, his friends had already gone on without him, and he briefly considered just going home or spending the rest of the waning day slumping around the town feeling sorry for himself. That would be too dull, he decided, so he started up the river by himself, skates clinking harshly in the winter hush. The quiet persisted even as Hans neared the lake, certainly not the amount of noise that several boys would make, and when he began to catch glimpses through the trees, the surface appeared empty. The idea that he might have actually left before everyone else hadn't even occurred to him, but it brought a little smile to his face. See if they made fun of him for being slow again any time soon. When Hans rounded the final bend in the river, it was to the sight of the almost empty lake stretched out before him. It would have been entirely empty, if not for the girl at the very center, hardly more than a blur of blue as she spun, one white boot held high above her head. From the lake's edge, Hans could hear the strange whoosh of her blade on the ice, smooth as water and metallic as the sound of a music box. slowing as she did until she turned out of her spin and glided off toward the other side of the lake. The light sound of her skates faded after her. Hans found he'd gotten halfway to the center of the lake himself without realizing he'd been moving, and he stopped so shortly that he almost lost his balance. The girl hadn't acknowledged him at all, but Mother had still taught him it was rude to stare, even if people didn't know you were staring. Hans stared anyway, and decided if she caught him and took issue, he would simply ask where she had gotten such well-made skates, and if she had seen his friends come by. Luckily, or perhaps unluckily, Hans wasn't sure, she didn't look at him at all, too busy skating in the most interesting patterns and turns, a bit like dancing, a bit like she was tracing an elaborate drawing on the ice. He shivered in the chilly wind after standing still so long. The sound of the other boys making their noisy way up the river startled him. It must have startled the girl too, because in the time it took him to glance around in their direction, she had both left the lake and vanished entirely, either into the forest or over the little rise in the field, skates and all. "There you are," said Carl. "We thought you weren't coming." "I thought you'd all left ages ago," said Hans. "Don't be so slow next time." They didn't have long before a watery sunset threatened, and they reluctantly declared it time to go back. Hans, as usual, found himself at the back of the little group, and some strange sound made him turn back toward the lake. The girl was back, at the center of the lake like she'd never left. She looked right at Hans this time and smiled. Hans almost managed to keep up with his friends all the way home. Ada complained all the way home from school the next day. "My feet hurt. You're running too fast. Why can't we go look in the window again? We always go look in the window." "We've only done that twice," said Hans. "Come on, I'll buy you a donut if you go fast with me today." Ada dug in her little heels and narrowed her eyes. "With the sugar on top?" "Whatever you like," said Hans. Joseph was already at the mouth of the river, putting together an arsenal of snowballs on the bank. Hans didn't skate to him across the pond as he usually would. Instead, he took the bridge over the canal, and then he left the road where he was sure to be out of Joseph's sight. Dry branches chattered and snagged at his clothes as he picked his way to the river's edge, and then he sat down on a large rock to put on his skates and stepped onto the river. The icy wind whipped by him, and he arrived panting and dry-throated to the edge of the lake. He heard the strange skater before he saw her, the click growl of skates carving across ice, and there she was, right at the center of the lake. She looked at him for the second time and waved a blue-gloved hand. Hans meant to wave back, but his hand got stuck somewhere near his shoulder, and he wasn't sure he waved at all. The small white skates stopped moving, and suddenly Hans wanted to run, skate as fast as he could all the way home, but then their owner would think him a coward, so he stayed, until she probably thought he was just a fool instead. Wind ruffled the hem of the blue dress, and Hans wondered how she could spin without getting tangled in it. "Hello." Hans's own skates almost flew right out from under him. "I've seen you watching me." The girl tilted her head ever so slightly to one side. "You spin," said Hans, like that was excuse enough. "I can show you how." Hans stammered. "Oh, you don't have to learn now." Her laugh was light as a flurry of snow swept up by the wind. "There's plenty of room here for both of us." "All right," said Hans. He couldn't skate as fast as any of the boys his age, but he imagined he could still probably skate faster than someone who spent most of their time spinning. Then it might be a more even trade if he did want her to teach him to spin too. "I'm Hans. What's your name?" She inclined her head again. "You can call me Lika, if you like." "All right," said Hans again, and his throat really was very dry from skating so fast in the cold air. He turned sharply and got a running start to skate faster than usual, he hoped, around the curve of the lake. The tracings on the surface raced along beneath him, but the icy wind did nothing to cool his face. He slowed, balanced on one foot, then the other, and pretended not to notice the swoosh of skates drawing closer behind him. He balanced again on one foot as long as he could, a whole count of 11, before he slowed too much and wobbled. Lika swept past him in a rush of cold air, and he hurried again to catch up. "You'll go faster if you turn your foot and push with the edge of your blade, you know." "I'm not trying to go too fast," said Hans, as he studied the way she pushed the edges of her skates against the ice. "Where are you from, anyway?" "Does it matter?" "I guess not. I live just down the river." "That's nice." The only sound after that was the click and swish of their skates, And then Hans looked up and Lika wasn't in front of him anymore. In her place scowled Joseph and the other boys behind him. "We waited for you," Carl grumbled. "I thought you'd left without me again." Hans glanced over his shoulder, but Lika was nowhere to be seen. "Well, we didn't. We might next time, if you're always going to leave without us anyway." That didn't quite make sense, or it wouldn't have if Hans hadn't been lying, but he used it to feel better anyway. Fortunately, nobody was really very upset, and none of them had seen Lika to tease him about, so there was nothing even to feel bad about to begin with. When the sun began to sink and they headed for home, Hans looked back one last time at the empty lake, which might not have been quite empty, but it was hard to tell through the trees. Hans knew he shouldn't, but the next day he took the same route across the bridge, through the forest, and up the river. Lika was there as he'd hoped, and she waved again before going back to pretending he wasn't there. Careful to keep out of her way, Hans skated close. "Will you show me how to spin like you?" Lika inclined her head the way she often did, so that she resembled a porcelain doll. "I'll have to teach you to skate first." "I know how to skate." "Like this." She took both his hands and pulled, and Hans had to hurry forward to keep from falling. Laughing, Lika pulled him even faster, while she skated backward, and he stumbled, found his feet again, stumbled again, and the wind snatched the hat right off his head. They wove and turned, Hans just managing to keep up with the sudden changes of direction. "What are we doing?" he shouted, in between bursts of alternately startled and delighted laughter over the rush of wind. "Just follow me." Lika's face wasn't even flushed from the activity or the cold, and her eyes stood out as dark and lustrous as the wood of Mother's music box. "Mother says I'm not old enough to dance with anyone yet," Hans joked. "Isn't it good that we're not dancing then?" Lika turned them around just like dancers on a floor. "Isn't it?" They circled the lake again and again, faster and faster, skates forming a sort of music of their own, and Hans thought he would like to keep on forever. "I have to go," said Lika. Hans's hands clenched around air, and he stumbled, only barely managing to right himself as he slowed to a stop. "I told you he'd be here, but he wasn't. What's the big idea?" Hans hadn't even heard them coming, but there they were, quite close by. Lika had disappeared entirely again, not that he wanted to be caught with her anyway. He floundered. "Would you rather play by yourself all the time now? Yes, are we not good enough for you to be around anymore?" "No." Hans shuffled his feet. "I'm practicing." "Practicing what?" Hans would rather cut off his own foot, but what he said was a better thing to give away than what he was really doing, he thought. "Have you ever noticed how I always have to run to keep up with you, and how I'm always the last to get anywhere when we go together? I thought you'd all left without me yesterday, and the day before, because I can barely keep up anyway, so I'm practicing." He scowled at the ice. "Sorry." "Don't be stupid," said Carl. "Yes, don't be stupid," said Gerwin, and that was the end of the discussion. There were no lessons the next day, and Hans took the little bit of money he'd saved from doing odd jobs for neighbors, and bought Ada the donut he'd promised. She was feeling generous and shared it with him, still warm from the fryer, with the crispy outside covered in half-melted sugar. Afterward, he would have liked to visit Lika again, but he didn't want to annoy his friends any further, so he hung about on the pond with Joseph and flicked bits of ice back and forth until the others arrived. Either Lika didn't like the other boys, or she was embarrassed to be seen with Hans the same way he was to be seen with her, and she was nowhere to be seen until they were all on their way again, and Hans chanced to look back, just in case. He startled. "Where did you come from?" Lika smiled with just her lips. "I missed you." "Sorry," said Hans. "My friends don't like it that I run off without them so much." "That's all right." Whatever had chilled Lika's expression like ice warmed back over to porcelain again. "Stay a little while?" Hans watched the other boys disappearing around a bend in the river. "I have to get home." "Just a bit? I've been lonely without you." "My mother worries if I'm not back before dark." Hans almost stayed anyway. "I'm sorry." He skated a few steps backward. "I'll see you soon." He turned and raced for home before she could say anything more. It was a good thing, too, because his friends had realized he wasn't with them and doubled back to be sure he hadn't fallen through the ice. Gerwin called him an old slowpoke, but then he looked like he felt bad and said he didn't really mean it, and Hans made up an excuse about his skate coming loose, and they all made it home only a little later than usual. "Did you get lost this time?" said Ada. "Only a little," said Hans. Inside the little house it was warm and bright, but the sound of the music box made him think of skating, around and around without an end, until the music wound down and it did end, and it was time to go to bed. The next day was a Sunday, and people from the town and many of the families from the surrounding farms crowded into the drafty church. Hans kept his eyes peeled for Lika, but he didn't see her anywhere. Sunday was a special quiet day, so after church was over, Hans had to go right home and sit nicely with Ada while Mother read aloud to them. He did this every Sunday, but for some reason he just could hardly hold still today, even more than usual. The music box had its day of rest on Sunday too, but Hans could have sworn he heard it playing, so faintly that he must have only imagined it. It was the wrong tune, anyway. Hopefully Lika hadn't looked for him and missed him. Surely she also had a day of rest on Sunday, or at least she could guess that Hans probably did. Somehow Hans was certain that she didn't. After lessons the next day, the other boys took a particularly long time to assemble. It seemed they might not go to the lake at all, which would be a shame, because then it would most likely take several days to get organized to go again, but finally Joseph showed up wearing a sheepish expression at the edge of the pond. As soon as he did, Hans was off up the river as fast as he could go. "Wait," said Carl. "Do we have time?" "Sure we do," Hans called over his shoulder. He pushed with the edges of his skates the way Lika did, and with the head start he had, he kept ahead of the others by about a bend in the river and burst onto the lake all by himself. "I'm here!" Lika smiled softly. "You are." She took his hands. "My friends are right behind me," said Hans. Lika's smile faded, but she quickly painted it back on again. "Will you stay just a little while after they leave? I have something to show you." Hans wavered. A delicate breeze ruffled the air between them. "As long as it's not too late." Lika was gone as quickly as she'd appeared, and Joseph zipped past him so close that the flapping end of his jacket whipped across Hans's arm. The sun was already low, and it wasn't long before they had to start for home. As the boys began to leave, Hans hesitated at the edge of the lake and pretended to struggle with his mitten. As it was, he had enough time to get home without hurrying too much, but he wouldn't be able to stay long, and his friends might notice he was missing and come back. "You stayed." Lika glided up behind him, and the sun wasn't so very low in the sky. They had a little while. She took his hands, and they flew across the lake together like skating in the sunset with the ice all pink in the light. There Hans was, imagining music again, but it was the perfect accompaniment for their skating, he supposed, delicate as an icicle and cold as Lika's hands even through their gloves. "We won't always get to do this." Hans frowned at her sudden melancholy. "What, you don't expect winter to last forever, do you?" "No." Hans hadn't thought of that. I'll walk here in the spring, and we can, I don't know, what do you like to do when it's not winter? Or you can come to town. Have you ever been to town? I've never seen you there before." "Once," said Lika. "I don't like being around so many different people. I wish we could just do this forever." "You must really love skating." "I've been doing it for a long time. I'll teach you to spin. Follow me." "I'd better be getting home pretty soon," said Hans. "It won't take long." The sun still wasn't too low, and there was plenty of light to get home by. Hans followed Lika's lead, and they spun together at the center of the lake while the edges became a blur. A few snowflakes floated down, light as the music that surrounded them. "Don't you wish we could go on forever?" The ice was still pink with the sunset, and Hans could imagine they really were in the sky. Lika's face was close to his as they held each other, a little pink from the sunset too, and one perfectly curled wisp of hair had come loose from the crown-like braid on her head. It would be soft to touch. "I know you do." Her eyes were as dark as the wood of Mother's music box, but they didn't shine so much in the sunset. "Just say it." The edges of the lake were such a blur that Hans couldn't even make them out anymore. Lika's eyes were dark as the water must be under the ice. Her grip grew a little painful. "Go on." They spun ever faster, until Hans caught the edge of his skate and fell sprawling across the ice. It wasn't pink anymore. "Oh." White skates stopped just in front of him. Hans scrambled up, and Lika met his stare, pale as a ghost in the dark. "Are you all right?" Hans had forgotten how to move, but now he remembered again, and tripped across the black lake as fast as he could. The sun was long past set, and the forest was so dark that he could only find his way by the faint shine of the river. The harsh scratching of his skates echoed behind him. He didn't look. Unseen branches clawed and held him back at the edges of the river. One must have been laden with icicles, which fell to the frozen river with a tinkling sound that kept going long after they had all broken, quick at first, then slower, slower. Hans clapped his hands over his ears, but he could still hear them. No matter how slowly the sounds came, there was always one more, one more. Hans tripped over nothing, slid, got up, and couldn't be sure of which direction he'd been going and from which direction he'd come. It was quiet now. Then, voices. At first Hans was sure he'd imagined them, but then they continued, voices he recognized, men from town, along with the flicker of lanterns through the trees. They must be looking for him, and he thought with a stab of guilt of Mother, who knew how late it really was. There was a bit of a clamor when he did meet them, everyone asking where he had gone and what he'd been thinking, and if he had any idea how worried his mother had been. Hans's teeth were chattering too hard to speak very much. Who knew how long he'd been out in the nighttime cold, either? He accepted the blanket that someone draped around him and pulled it as tight as he could. Mother came running to hug him and drag him inside, and Hans shivered at the kitchen table and watched the hard line of her shoulders while she set a kettle on the fire. She didn't turn around until the water was hot and the strong herbal tea was ready, and the steaming cup met well-worn wood with a heavy thunk. So, Hans shrank further into his blanket. I'm certain my son wouldn't sneak out to skate about in the dead of night without a very, the kettle clattered back into place, good, the fireplace poker too, reason. The tea box whispered back onto the shelf. Mother turned again and held very still. Hans opened his mouth and closed it again. You might have left a note before going on such an all-important adventure. Hans squinted into the steam of his tea. I didn't sneak out. No. Mother seemed to draw herself up twice as tall in the corner of his vision. Then what would you like to call it instead? I was never home. Hans looked around the little kitchen like he might find an answer in a sack of flour or a jar of pickled beets. I only meant to stay at the lake a little longer, but I lost track of time. I never meant to stay out so late. Don't lie to me, young man, Mother hissed. Do you have any idea what a shock it was to suddenly find your bed empty, your coat and skates gone, and no idea where you'd gone? In the dead of night? Why, anything could have happened to you. I'm sorry. Hans dropped his voice at Mother's warning look. I'm sorry. Curiosity tugged at him despite it all. What time did I get home? Mother stopped short. For a moment, her face showed the same confusion that Hans felt, and then she shook her head. Don't be ridiculous. Drink your tea before it gets cold. After failing again to either provide an answer for Mother or gain one for himself, Hans was sent off to bed in disgrace. Mother wound the music box up again and again, the way she only did when she was very upset, but it sounded all wrong, none of the notes that Hans knew by heart in the right places. He put his pillow over his head, and after a long time, finally fell asleep. Since he'd had plenty of time to play during the night, Hans wasn't allowed to go out to play with his friends the next day, or for several more after that. It was hardly unfair. Whether he'd gotten home hours late or snuck out after bedtime, it didn't really matter, but he puzzled over it. Ada, he said as they walked home from school, was I really home in time for dinner? I don't remember, said Ada. You must have been, or Mother would have worried much sooner. Weren't you scared going out in the dark? Of course not, said Hans. He thought as little as he could about Lika, or the lake, or the half-imagined music that sometimes drifted through his thoughts like it was blown in from somewhere far off by the wind. This grew easier with each passing day, until the day he was allowed to go out with his friends again, and skated to join them like one of the stones from the mill had been tied around his middle and was dragging behind him. Maybe we could just stay in town today, he said. My father thinks it's going to storm any day now, said Carl. We might not get to go for a while. Hans didn't mind being left at the back of the group all the way to the lake, and he made sure he was the last to step out onto the wide surface. Whenever he caught movement at the edge, he averted his eyes. Even with his friends around him, the air felt still. When it was time to leave, he raced to keep from being last, and he didn't once look over his shoulder all the way home. Mother's music box was a welcome sound in the evening. Hans tried to hold on to each note as it slowed, just in case it was the last, and thought of water dripping from the last icicles in spring. That was still some time away, but he thought of what Lika had said. Poor Lika must think he didn't want to see her any more, and really, what had she done wrong? It might take some time for him to convince her he did still want to skate together, and for her to forgive him for trying so hard to avoid even looking at her, and by then spring might be very close indeed. Hans could hardly wait for morning to come. He could hardly wait for school to end too, and for Ada to hurry along home. Gerwin was late that day, and Hans wanted to just run off without the others again, but what he didn't want was to exchange Lika's annoyance for theirs. So he waited, and again he ran off as soon as he could no longer be considered to be leaving without anyone, and reached the lake before the others. "Lika!" he panted. "I knew you'd come back." Lika's smile was soft as a snowbank, not a trace of the anger Hans had feared. Nevertheless, he thought she looked a little surprised to see him. "I'm sorry we lost track of time so badly," she went on. "I hope you weren't in too much trouble." "Some," said Hans. "I just wanted to say sorry for avoiding you yesterday. It was just as much my fault. I was just surprised, I guess." "It's all right," said Lika. "We won't be able to do this all the time. Let's not waste it." "Actually, I don't know how much I can come by myself anymore." This wasn't what Hans had planned to say at all. "My friends don't like when I come without them, and I can't stay after dark." He didn't want to look at her face, so he looked at her skates instead, small and white. "I understand." Hans looked up in surprise. "I don't want to cause trouble for you. Will you come skate with me just one more time?" "All right," said Hans. "And we can still see each other sometimes, maybe. I'll visit you in the spring like I said, and if you ever want to come to town, we'll see." The other boys clattered out of the forest, and Hans turned, knowing Lika would be gone when he looked back. The millstone was back around him, but it wore away as he and his friends played and chased each other around until the sun began to go down. Lika was nowhere to be seen when he looked back, and the millstone was replaced by the feeling that he was a coiled spring, like a music box after the crank was wound up, but it hadn't been let go yet. The spring wound tighter and tighter all through the next day's lessons, when the quiet was loud on top of the scratching of slate pencils, the crackle of the wood stove, and the occasional whisper that was quickly hushed by the teacher. When that was done, the only thing to possibly do was run, which Hans did. Even the town was quiet. Hans's footsteps felt loud enough to give him away as he crossed the bridge and turned off into the forest. The spring wound ever tighter the nearer he got to the lake, until finally he left the trees and it was released. Lika spun at the middle of the lake, one skate held above her head like the tail of a scorpion. The sound of her blade on the ice mixed with the light melody plucked from the dry branches of trees by the wind to accompany her. For a strange moment, Hans was afraid to disturb her, as he had been when he saw her that first time, but he shook himself. She had invited him, after all. They danced and turned across the surface of the lake to half-imagined music, mitten in thin-gloved hand. Hans hoped his friends would be very, very late in coming. Even so, the sun sank inexorably lower in the sky, and the music began to slow, imperceptibly at first, until Hans could no longer deny that it was indeed slower. Lika had slowed too. "I suppose you'll have to be going soon." "Not yet," said Hans. "But you will. I just wish—" Hans hung on her words and waited with caught breath for the next. The lake was silent. Hans squeezed Lika's cold hands. "I wish we could go on forever." Lika smiled so widely that it hardly resembled a smile at all. Suddenly, Hans wanted to run. They were at the center of the lake, and she held him tightly as they spun. Faster and faster went the music, and around they went, until the edges of the lake were such a blur that they could no longer be seen. Snow drifted down over them, light against Hans's cheeks, and settling glittering atop Lika's hair. Hans remembered the storm that Karl's father had predicted, and opened his mouth to speak, but just as quickly as it had begun, the dusting of snow ended. They were beginning to slow. With a whoop, Carl sped past, so close that he could have struck Hans's skate. Hans made to leap out of Lika's embrace and found he couldn't. He tried again, but she didn't budge, nor could he force them to fall, even balanced on one foot as he was. His friends raced and laughed and shouted around them, not once sparing so much as a glance in their direction. Hans stared at the place where the blue painted glove overlapped his own mitten. He tugged all the more, or thought he did, and looked up in horror. A vacant smile painted Lika's porcelain face. Flat brown eyes gazed right past Hans as they continued to spin, around and around, slower and slower. The boys on the lake became a forest of people walking about them. The sky became a glass dome, and the music became the final plink of a music box nearing the end of its song, like the last drops of melting snow off the eaves in spring. Plink. They had nearly stopped. Plink. Hans held his breath. Plink. That's all for now. If you made it this far, thank you so much for reading and or listening, and please leave a like and subscribe.